Now we would like to introduce Mr. Nicholas Barnard. He is a specialist curator in Jain art, and here at SOAS you can also see his exhibition, so please go take a look. And here is Mr. Nicholas Barnard.
Thank you very much indeed. And many thanks to Nirav and to Bav and to Pratula for inviting me to speak today. It's lovely to be here, and so great to see such a wonderful turnout for this event and to see the launch of the exhibition. So, let's see if this will work. Yeah. I'd like to take you on a little journey across to the other side of London, to South Kensington, to the Victoria and Albert Museum, where I work. And I hope you'll enjoy seeing some of the treasures of Jain art that we have in our collection. I'm going to be talking about sculptures and paintings in our collection, and I'm going to take a little bit of a deep dive into the wonderful Parshvanatha figure that you can see in the exhibition here, which has been lent from the V&A's collection. So here's the V&A. This is the facade, which was opened in 1909. And these are the oldest buildings of the museum, the Lecture Theatre Block, which was opened in the 1860s. This is the lovely museum and garden. The very elegant pond was opened by the museum without any intention that small children would use it as a paddling pool. But of course they did, and of course the museum realised that actually this is a wonderful thing, and it was a very good idea to have a little paddling pool in the museum, so everyone was very happy. Now, the connections, and really the point when I began to get really, really interested in Jain art, the connections with the Jain community in the UK really took a great leap forward with the Peaceful Liberators exhibition. I'm sure some of you will remember it. It took place in the V&A in 1995-6, having started in Los Angeles and travelled to two venues in the United States, in Texas and New Orleans. And this was an exhibition where quite a few of the works from our collection were put on display. So you can see, if I can get this laser, yes, here we are, the wonderful Garderasar and the white marble statue of Chandra Prabhu in there, and of course the photographs of Satyajaya and the model of a Jain temple that were shown in this exhibition. And that the process of fundraising for that exhibition enabled us to put together a pot of money, which has helped us to do activities around Jain art and to make some new acquisitions since then. So it's really had a kind of ongoing life. So here is the Gallery of South Asian Sculpture at the V&A, and that was first opened in 1988, but we rearranged it in 2011, and we divided it up by religion, because we thought that would be easier for the average visitor, who often doesn't know very much about the iconography of the Indian religions, to understand. So straight here in front of you, you can see the display plinth with Buddhist art. We have Hindu objects on this side of the gallery, and we're looking here into the main South Asia gallery, which contains our paintings and our textiles and our jewellery, arms and armour, etc. But here in the South Asian sculpture, the Jain material is in this side, and you can see the small display case with the small metal artifacts, which I'm going to show you again in a few moments. So here are the Jain sculptures on the display plinth at the moment. So you can see images of the four Tirthankaras, plus four sculptures of the Tirthankaras, plus an image of Ambika on the side. And I'll look particularly at this Shantinata image, this Parshvanatha, and then the Ambika from this display. So this is one of the finest objects in the V&A collection. It was originally displayed by the India Museum, which is a museum set up by the East India Company in 1801, and its collections were dispersed in 1879 when it was closed down, and over 19,000 objects from the India Museum came to the V&A, which was then called the South Kensington Museum, and it included this wonderful metal alloy figure. And it's very large and extremely fine. You don't often get metal objects of this size. So it's about 117 centimetres high. So it's cast in metal alloy. It's a seated meditating figure of the 16th Jina, Shantinata. How do we know that? Well, there are two reasons. One is he has in front of him, on top of the meditating cushion, there's a very tiny figure of a deer, which is the Lakshana, the cognizance of Shantinata. But on the other side of the meditating cushion, unfortunately you can't see it in this photograph, there's an inscription in Sanskrit which says that it's to the triumph of Shantinata, and it gives a date which translates to 1167 to 1168 of the Common Era. And it's a really extraordinary image. So it's cast in copper alloy, but the details are inlaid. So the lips are pure copper. The Srivatsa, or auspicious mark on the chest, is of silver and copper. And on the meditating cushion, you have all these little details in silver and copper. And the figures, details like the hands and the feet are extremely finely done. And when you look at the top, you see a rather strange gap in the center of the forehead. So that's where there would probably have, excuse me, not in the forehead, in the pupils of the eyes. And where those little gaps are, there probably would have been precious or semi-precious stones originally, which would have been taken out at some point during its history. Now, the figure dates, as I said, to about 1167, but the backplate is later. It might date to as late as the 15th century. And what's wonderful about it, in a way, is I think when you look at the meditating figure of Shantinata, you can see that great sense of calmness, that great sense of spiritual achievement. And that, in a way, contrasts with all the wonderful activity in the backplate of all the celestial figures who are coming to pay homage, to honour the Jinnah. So at the top row, we have all these celestial musicians, each playing a different instrument. Then we have gods riding on the elephants to come and pay honour. And there are garland bearers as well, you can see, with these garlands of flowers. And then the two fly whisk bearers, again, a sign of the great honour with which he's held, standing on either side of him. And the backplate is made of 3 sections, so you have a top section and 2 side sections. And something's missing. Apart from the pupils of the eyes, you can see these little sockets and this circular sort of plug there. So those would probably have been used to contain the sacred umbrella, the Chhatravali, that would have added to his sacred or regal status, the parasol that you'd see above a figure of a Jinnah. And this is another of our finest figures. This is quite a lot earlier. This dates to maybe around 600. It's a figure of Parshvanatha. So you can see, as with all images of Parshvanatha, he's being sheltered by the Nagaraja, the serpent king Dharanendra. And you can see his 7 heads on this canopy above him, and the sinuous coils of his body behind him. And as well as the serpent king Dharanendra, his wife Padmavati, who also has the serpent's heads above, like a kind of canopy above her head, she's holding up this parasol or umbrella above him. And this image of Parshvanatha reminds us of the story in which a demon, whose name was Samvara or Megamalin, sent a storm to try and disrupt Parshvanatha from his meditation, to try and prevent him from achieving his omniscience, from his Kevala Jnana. And at the very top of the figure, you could see these images of clouds carved out, which suggest the strength of the rainstorm which the demon sent against him. And it's said that the floodwaters reached the tips of his nose, but he continued with his meditation undisturbed. And again, you can see these flying, celestial, heavenly garland bearers on either side. You can see hands playing drums at the top, so celestial music. Again, the fly whisk bearers, Chamaradharas on either side. And then below, with the lotus petals, the classical lion throne supported Simhasana, with the 2 lions on either side, and the little figure of Agana supporting a Dharma Chakra, the wheel of the law, the teachings. So it's carved in sandstone. It's a very gentle and spiritual image, I think. His eyes are downcast. He's looking slightly downward, and it's got that kind of soft modelling of if you look at the torso, the slight fleshiness, and all these features are very typical of the post-Gupta period, when there was a very, very spiritual period of Indian sculpture. So that's why this fits in with this period around 600. It comes from Madhya Pradesh, from Garaspur, and a place near Bilsa, where there are a series of Digambara temples. Now, I mentioned Ambika, and Ambika, this very popular goddess. How do we know it's Ambika? Well, Ambika is, of course, a protector of children. So you can see her 2 sons. One is here, her 2 sons, Siddha and Buddha. And she's also a goddess associated with fertility. So she's sitting underneath this wonderful mango tree with the ripe mangoes at the end of the boughs, and she's holding in her hand a stem of ripe mangoes. So you really have this sense of fertility and protection and childbirth associated with her. She's sitting on this lotus petal throne, and there's a lion, her vahana, her vehicle, underneath it, and these two little kneeling figures must be the donors who paid for the sculpture to be made. Okay, and it's very beautifully carved. If you look closely, if you come to the V&A gallery and look at it, you'll see that in the bun of her hair, that each individual strand of hair is carved, and all the details of her earrings and the strands of pearls in her hair are all very beautifully carved in very great detail. It's carved in chloritic schist, which obviously allows a high level of detailed carving. And one more thing I want to mention about her iconography. So, of course, as I'm sure many of you know, the pairs of a god and goddess, the Yaksha, Yakshi, are associated with each of the 24 Tirthankaras, and they're called Shasana Devatas. And Ambika is the Yakshi who is associated with the 22nd Tirthankara, Neminata. So if we look at the upstairs level, you can see here seated a Jinna in meditation. So this must be Neminata because of the association with Ambika. And again, you have garland bearers, fly whisk bearers and garland bearers on either side of him. And then we have, opposite the display of large sculptures, we have a small case showing bronze objects for temples or for domestic shrines. And I wanted to look particularly at this very beautiful image. This is perhaps the finest of our little bronzes. And it is a Tritirtha image. Oh, sorry. That was not supposed to happen. Which shows one Jinna seated in meditation with two Jinnas standing in the Kayotsarga position on either side of them. And of course, these seated meditation posture and the standing Kayotsarga body abandonment posture are the only two postures that Jinnas are represented in these sculptures. So again, we have the garland bearers and the fly whisk bearers and a splendid throne with a dharma chakra and lions and elephants and a row of planetary deities at the front. Now, there used to be 8 planetary deities and there became 9. So this has been done at a stage where there were still 9. This dates to about 1000 of the Common Era. It's a process that the transition from 8 planetary deities to 9 took some time, and it happened at different times in different parts of India. But you can see these little blobs represent, each one of these blobs represents one of the planetary gods. And in the center there is a pair of deer flanking a Dharma chakra, a wheel of the law. And again you have the umbrella at the top, a little figure playing salutation up there. And then the two figures, the Yaksha and the Yakshi. Now, there's no inscription on the back. This is a little bit unusual for bronzes because they very often have detailed inscriptions which tell you who the Jinna is or the main Jinna, what the date was, who commissioned it, all these sorts of fascinating details which historians really love. But this one doesn't have any inscription. So who is the central Jinna, who, by the way, has a silver inlay for the Srivatsa symbol? Here, well, again, we can probably tell from the image of the Yakshi here, because she has a child on her knee. So this is probably an image of Ambika. And her partner, the Yaksha, her consort, was the Yaksha Gomedha. And one of his symbols, which he holds, is a fruit. And this figure, if you look very carefully, he's holding a little fruit. So this is probably Ambika and Gomedha, and they are the Yakshi and Yaksha of Neminata, the 22nd Jinna. So probably Neminata with two other Jinna figures. Okay, so I would like you now to ask you to bear with me while I go on a little bit of a deeper dive into this spectacular sculpture, which is on display here in Pure Soul, into a journey to Karnataka to try and find out a little bit more about the origins of this fascinating piece. This is certainly one of the finest sculptures in the V&A. It's made of stone, but it's so highly polished that people often look at it and they think that it's metal, that it might be brass. They look at the sort of yellowish patina around the kneecaps that makes it look almost brassy. And the details are incredibly finely done. So again, it's Parshvanatha standing with the Dharanendra, the Nagaraja, with his 7-headed snake canopy and the body of the snake very beautifully done behind him. And as well as this main image of Dharanendra, he also appears as a god, with Padmavati. So here is Dharanendra, here is Padmavati as the Shasana Devatas. And here they are in this image. And one of the remarkable things about it is the minimalism with which this image is shown. So very often in Jain sculptures from southwest India, we know this comes from Karnataka, the surround is carved in enormous detail. But here it's almost completely plain. And instead of having a pair of figures holding the fly whisks, the Chamaradaras, which we've seen in the sculptures of the Jinnas so far, here we just have the fly whisks on their own, on these strange tusk-like projections which support the figure at the shoulders. And he's cut out, so he's not just flat on a single piece of stone, it's cut out so that he appears to have more depth and, in a sense, more reality when the way that he's standing within this arch because of the space between the stone and the figure. So it's a really remarkable piece of sculpture. But we have some questions about it. So it came very early to London in 1808. I'll talk a little bit more about that. But there is a lot of discussion about where exactly it comes from. And different people who've written books and articles about it have also attributed it to different places within Karnataka, some places that may be sort of 300 kilometres apart. And until quite recently, we weren't even really sure what stone it was. It was labelled as black shale because it had a slight laminar structure. Then we looked at some other sculptures in Karnataka, thought, well, maybe it's basalt. But just recently, literally, I think about a week ago, we got some results back from the Natural History Museum from analytical work they did, and it turns out that it's schist, and that works well with some other sculptures in the region. So that's a nice thing to have found out. But still, so we know what it's made of, but we're still not exactly sure about when and where it was made. So I'm going to just talk about that a little bit. But first, just to talk about the details. So if you look at the triple-tiered parasol above his head, look at the amazing detail it's carved in. And look at the snake heads with their forked tongues and the way that the details of their necks are carved on the underside of the canopy. And again, the fly whisks, the little flowers that form struts, because if you didn't have any struts, then it would be a little bit too fragile. It could easily be broken. You need some things to support it, to hold it in place with its backplate. But if you look at the figure, you have the three lines, conventional three lines of beauty on the neck, but you also have these three lines carved on the chest. And the upper one forms a complete circle, but the two below it are broken. So they get wider apart. So you have very subtle means. It indicates the swelling volumes of the chest. So I think it's very sophisticated sculpturally. And then below the navel, another three lines, concentric lines, again showing that volume of the chest and sort of subtly indicating folds of flesh. So really remarkable sculpture. If you look at the details, you can even see that the pupils of the eyes are incised in the figure. And the figure has an inscription on the base in Hala Kannada, in Old Kannada letters, right? And the inscription is below the images of the Yaksha and Yakshi, of Dharanendra and Padmavati, and you can see they're holding the Ankush, the elephant goad, and the noose, and they have the cobra head above them. And the inscription explains how this figure was commissioned by a merchant called Mali Sethi to repair damage that was done to Jain temples during an era of persecution. So I'll talk a little bit more about that. But first, let's look at the back. And you can walk, in this exhibition, you can walk right round the back, and you can see this. The gallery have done an excellent job of lighting these letters so that you can see them. Parasanat, that's an anglicisation of Pashwanata, of course. The date, 1806. When the sculpture was found by C. McKay. But who is C. McKay? Colin Mackenzie is C. McKay. He was born in Stornoway on the Isle of Lewis in the Scottish Outer Hebrides in 1754. He was a very gifted mathematician, and he was eventually to become the first Surveyor General of the East India Company in 1815. And Mackenzie wasn't just a map maker. He was someone who had a passionate interest in finding about Indian history and religion and culture. And he created this enormous collection which he intended to use to understand better the culture of India, particularly South India, where he spent most of his career. And this painting shows Mackenzie with his colleagues at Karkal, where the famous Jain site with a very large monolithic Bahubali image, like the one at Shravanabelagola. And So Mackenzie was collecting these manuscripts, but he didn't know any of the Indian languages. So he was very heavily dependent on his Indian translators and scholars to help him in this process. And he greatly valued their work, and they really worked together as a team. And he was, he really expressed his indebtedness to them in this research that he was doing. And Mackenzie, as a result of all this study, he was one of the first Europeans to understand Jainism as a distinct religion, because at that time, Europeans often confused Jainism with Buddhism. They didn't really, and that carries on for quite a long time. But Mackenzie was, I think, certainly the first British person to write about Jainism as a separate religion. So that's in around, I forget the date exactly, but it's about 1810. It's very, very early on. So Mackenzie then sends a letter to Charles Wilkins, who's the first librarian of the East India Company, East India House in London. And he sends it from Madras, now Chennai, in 1808. And he says, I have by the Phoenix a ship in this fleet, shipped a Jain statue addressed to the Court of Directors, that's the directors of the East India Company, carefully packed up in a strong case, so that's still the case today, which Captain Marsden of that ship promised to take care of. So the statue in question is one of the 24 tirthas, or prophets, who they believe were sent to the world to direct mankind. It is so well cut, and has escaped so well the fate of many others, being undefaced and unmutilated, that I conceived that it would be a proper object for the museum at the India House. So that's the India Museum, which I mentioned earlier. And I therefore had it carried down here at my own expense, upwards of 500 miles across the peninsula, from near Garsapa, that's Garsapa, on the back borders of the Ghats of Kanara, so that's the western seaboard of Karnataka, in the Ghats, where I found it with some others in an ancient Jain temple or basti. The place has been ruined for some time, but I am not able yet to ascertain its age. And we do know now that the Jain kingdom of Garsapa flourished between about 1409 and about 1610, when it was destroyed by a neighbouring kingdom. So he sends the sculpture back to London, and with it he sends this beautiful drawing, and you can see a copy of the drawing in the exhibition. So we know without any doubt whatsoever that it's the same sculpture that he's talking about. And a lot of wonderful work was done on this by Jennifer Howes, who used to be at the British Library, on these Mackenzie archives. And so it's displayed there at the Indian Museum from about 1808. And just to say a word about the Indian Museum, so it was in the headquarters of the East India Company, East India House in Leadenhall Street in the City of London. The building no longer exists, but you can see an old painting of it here. This picture, it's not as old as when the sculpture came in 1808, but it's from the Illustrated London News of 1858, and it shows a new extension that they built that gave them a lot more space to show Indian sculptures. Now, I've looked at this print from the Illustrated London News very carefully and hoped to try and identify objects in our Jain collections. It's pretty difficult to do. I think this figure here might be a Jain image. The arm is raised, which it shouldn't be, but there are all sorts of mistakes, because if it was for example, if it was a Buddha figure in Abhaya Mudra, then it would be the right arm that was raised, not the left arm. So we know that there are mistakes. But what I'm really intrigued by is if you look at the far distance, this figure in the niche, and I just wonder, because around the image of around the statue in the exhibition, there are little traces of plaster, and I just wonder if that could have been the figure that was in the niche in this picture. Unless we find another picture, we won't be able to prove it, but it's just one of the questions I have. Yeah. Now, when Mackenzie sent his drawing, he also sent a facsimile of the inscription, and he sent a translation of that inscription from Hale Kannada. And he had, there was what he described as an old Jain Purohit who was in the area, who knew the old languages, and Mackenzie employed him and got him to translate this inscription for him. So the Purohit explained about the inscription, and the inscription mentions that the sculpture was installed at a place called Yarambaragaya. Okay, and the Purohit said that Yarambaragaya was an old name for Garsapa. Okay, and that's where Mackenzie found it. So all the evidence, when we're asking about where it came, so all the evidence is at this stage pointing towards Garsapa. So here is Garsapa in the Western Ghats. So here's a photograph of Garsapa. So as I mentioned, it was abandoned in about 1610. Here it is in 1890, the photograph. You can see it's very overgrown. You see trees poking out through the top of the Chaturmukha Basti. This is the largest of the temples there. And there used to be, I think, 108 temples at Gyaltsapa, but since it was abandoned, there are only now about sort of 5 or so temples. This is by far the largest. And I went in 2012 when it was in the stage of restoration. So you can see that the main temple being rebuilt. So it's a fascinating site. It's a very beautiful site. It's on what effectively a jungle track, about 1 mile away. You have to cross the river, and it's about 1 mile away from the actual village of Gyaltsapa, and it's called Nagara Bastikeri. So that's the name that has been attached to this ancient Jain city, this abandoned Jain city, effectively in the jungle. So it's a really beautiful site, and there are several other temples, but I was ultimately, in a sense, disappointed by my visit because I hoped that I'd go there and I would see other sculptures just like the one in the V&A, and I'd be able to say, yes, it's just like these. But there aren't really. There are several other very fine sculptures, but they're mostly later in date, and they're in a different stone, and it's just really, most of them are not really very similar to it. So went away with some questions still about, was it really from Gyaltsapa? Did something else happen? So if you look again at the Hala Kannada inscription, so as I mentioned, the place Yarambaragaya was given, which the old Jain Purohit translated as a name for Gyaltsapa. But the inscription was translated by L.D. Barnard in 1915, and he read the name of the city as Erambarage, which he said was Yelbarga. And that's a town in Karnataka, but it's over 100 miles to the northeast of Gyaltsapa, right on the other side of the Ghats and up on the plateau. So a very different location. So I'll just give you here, you can see this text in the exhibition, but this is the translation of the inscription by L.D. Barnett. And he explains how the teacher, Rayacharya, encouraged for the temple to be rebuilt and the statue to be made when the religion of Erambarage, which he translates as Yelburga, had perished through the persecution of Mummadi Singha. And he says, noble sage, live again. And he comments, the decayed parts of the temple are restored in the city of Erambarage, the temple that belonged to the Rona community, so the community of the city of Rona, which is not very far from Yelburga in Karnataka, in the line of Kunda Kunda, so it's the Kunda Kundanvaya, and the Pustakagacha, the Deshyagana, and the Mula Sangha. So this is a whole line of, a whole religious line within the particular communities of the Digambara Jain religion. And it explains how the teacher, in the inspiration of this teacher, Mali Seti, the son of Ketisiti of Minnagudali, caused to be made this image of Parshvadeva. And by the increase of his merit, and his merit gained increased. The stone engraver was Chakravarti Paloja. So this is exceptional for a number of reasons. So Chakravarti Paloja, that means we have the name of the sculptor, and that, of course, is generally very rare in Indian sculpture. So we've got a name for this ancient or medieval Indian sculpture. And we've got this religious lineage saying how it came from through the line of the Kunda Kundanvaya and the various teachers. More recent scholarship, there are problems with the inscriptions, so mistakes and so forth, so there are slightly variations of the readings. One of them is that there was a monk called Balendu who was involved who was the one who told Mali Seti to have the image made. But a lot of the key details are very much the same, and modern scholars mostly agree with the identification of Erambarage with Yelburga. But who is this Mummadi Singha? Now, this is another problem, because Barnett said that because of the shape of the letters in the inscription, it must belong to about 1150 to 1175. And he said then that Mummadi Singha was a member of the Sindha dynasty who were ruling in that area at that time. But this has been really questioned, because Mummadi means the third, and this person was not the third of this dynasty. So most scholars nowadays think that this is a character called Mummadi Singha Nayaka, and he was active about 100 years later, between about 1250 and 1320. So if that's correct, we're moving our sculpture back about 100 years from Barnett's date. Muhammadi Singh Nayaga was this pugnacious character who fought against these great empires, such as the Seuna Empire in Devagiri. And he carved out this little independent kingdom of his own in the area around Hampi, if you know Vijayanagar, the city there, just in that area. And of course that in itself is very near to Yelborga, not that far from Rona. So that in itself seems like quite a plausible connection. There's another contender for the Muhammadi Singha, because Professor Hampana Nagarajaya sent some very helpful information to me about the inscription, and he suggested it could be, there's another Muhammadi Singha, who's the third Singha of the Seuna dynasty, who ruled between 1312 and 1313. So he is a little bit later, but again, it's not that far off the date. So again, whichever way we look at it, we're looking at late 13th, early 14th century. He only ruled for a very, very short time, so he wouldn't have had much time for doing things to Jain temples. So that's just another question I have. But just to show you where we are, so where is Yelbarga? Well, right in the middle here, you can see the city of Yelbarga. And here is Ron, the place whose community the temple belonged to. So very close by. And here's Gersupa right down here on the Ghats, so it's really kind of a long way away. Now, it's also near to Kopal, and Kopal is important because Kopal was a great Jain centre. According to inscriptions that have been found at Shravanabelagola and then later at Kopal itself, it was said to have had 700 Jain bastis, Jain temples, but now only one of them survived. So Kopal is one of the places that really suffered from the contraction of Jainism in this region of north and central Karnataka. And this particularly starting from the 12th century with the rise of the Virashaiva movement. The Jains were sadly persecuted, and a lot of Jain sculptures were broken, and the Jain temples fell into disuse. So it's really kind of, but it was in its day very, very important. And Yelbarga falls within the modern district of Kopal, so it's very much within that region. And here, just as some of the evidence of the Jain activity, here are these carvings of monks who have achieved moksha or of Tirthankaras on the side of the great fortress hill here at Kopal. And scholars have talked about a Kopal style of sculpture with black polished stone, very highly polished, just like the V&A one. So this is beginning to look quite interesting about the possible links with this region of Karnataka. And then I went to the Salajung Museum, and imagine my surprise when I saw these two figures on the centre and on the right, and particularly the one in the middle, is so close in so many aspects to the V&A sculpture. So you have the same tusk-like projections holding the figure. He's a Parshvanatha in the centre. It's actually a 24 Jinnah figure, because you have 23 small images of the Jinnahs climbing up around the surround. But the central figure is Parshvanatha. Again, he has the umbrella and these little images of Dharanendra and Padmavati. And the shape of the base is very similar, with these irregular kind of step-like projections. And then here is another image of the Panchaparameshtis, the 5 supreme beings. Again, has the similar kind of shape of the base. Again, it's very plain backdrop. It's not the very ornate kind of backdrops that you get with, for example, with Hoysala sculpture. So very kind of restrained, and the little fly whisks on either side. Now, these figures were of particular interest because they're labelled as coming from Kopal. But when you dig a little bit deeper, you find that actually the attribution to Kopal is a mistake. They were not actually found at Kopal, they were found at Yelborga. And they were moved to Kopal by about 1930 and installed in a temple there, and then they were taken to the Salajung Museum. And the story goes that they were discovered in the untouchable quarter in Yelborga in about 1916. And the person who has published these suggested that they might have been buried in order to save them from being vandalized. At that time, when Jainism was really on a back foot, when there's a lot of persecution happening, the figures were probably hidden away. So it's possible that those figures were hidden at around the same time that the V&A figure was moved away from Yelborga. So this is the way that, we're thinking. So if you compare the two figures, you can see how close they are in the details. If you look at the way that the snake canopy is done, it's almost identical. The details of the jewel in the lower tier of the umbrella, the fly whisks and the little flowers on the struts, you can see that they're very, very almost identical in their treatment. And then, of course, the little images of Padmavati at the base, almost identical again in the way that they're treated. So these sculptures, they must be from the same workshop or from sculptors who were very closely connected to each other. Okay, so the theory now is that, I want to try and put forward is that the sculptures were made, all three sculptures were made in Yelborga, near to Kopal, and they're part of that Kopal style of sculpture with the finely polished black stone. But at the same time as the Salajung Museum figures are hidden, the V&A one is moved, and it's taken away, and it's taken to Gyaltsapa. Now, why is it taken to Gyaltsapa? Because under the Vijayanagar kingdom, there were areas around the coast of Karnataka where Jainism was effectively safe, and there were kingdoms where Jainism could flourish. And the Gyaltsapa kingdom was one of those where Jainism did flourish, and it flourished, as I said, from about 1409 to about 1610. And I imagine that when they were building new temples, like this Vijayanagar period, Chalmukha Basti in the centre, that would have been a very prestigious thing to install this very beautiful image of Parshvanatha in a temple there. So that's my theory, that it moved overland more than 200 kilometres to Gyaltsapa. Okay, then it has its onward history. So then Colin Mackenzie finds it in 1806. He sends it to the Indian Museum in 1808. In 1879, that goes to the V&A. Then it travels to Los Angeles, Texas, and New Orleans for the Peaceful Liberators exhibition. And it also goes to beautiful Stornoway in the Isle of Lewis in Scotland, where it's shown in 2017 in an exhibition called Colin Mackenzie Collector Extraordinaire, where they borrowed all sorts of things from Mackenzie's archive. And now finally, here it is at SOAS in the Pure Soul exhibition. So it's been seen by an extraordinary number of people around the world. And I think that, that how many of those people were inspired by looking at a beautiful sculpture like that to think about Jainism, to think about asking questions about Jainism or about Indian sculpture and that kind of thing. So it's interesting in itself that it's had such a kind of wide exposure to such a diverse public. Now, I don't know, yes, and so you can see, I just put it on a map so you can sort of see those incredible movements, starting in Yelborga, moving to Gyaltsapa, then to Chennai, where Mackenzie puts it on a ship, and off it goes. Okay, so, now I don't know how much time I've got left. Is it, I keep quick now? Yeah, okay, so I'm gonna whiz through. I get carried away, sorry. So I'm going to talk to you, just show you some of the highlights from our Jain paintings and manuscripts collections. So this is a beautiful page from a Kalpasutra manuscript, and Jain paintings are particularly important in the history of Indian art because lots of them survive from a period particularly between about 1200 and 1500 when Hindu paintings and Buddhist paintings don't really survive in such numbers. So Jain paintings are the best record of what Indian painting was like between about 1200 and 1500. And they have this very distinctive Western Indian painting style. And the most single characteristic feature is the way that the further eye protrudes beyond the line of the cheek. So you can always see that in these Western Indian paintings. And they don't have a sense of, they have bold colours, but they're flat and quite linear, and they don't suggest receding into space. Now, this example from about 1460 is from a period where they really enjoyed using very expensive pigments. A lot of gold, as you can see, lots of gold, and lots of ultramarine blue that comes from lapis lazuli, that rare pigment from Afghanistan. So here, this one shows from a Kalpasutra manuscript, the birth of Mahavira. This one, even more splendid, shows the movement of Mahavira's embryo from Devananda to Rani Trishula, so that he can be born to a Kshatriya woman. And all the amazing marginal decoration is typical to the kind of opulent style that developed about 1490. Again, this Western Indian painting style. And here's a more typical example from about 1500. And this is Mahavira's Diksha when he's plucking out his hair, and the god Shakra is collecting them in 5 handfuls. So it's another Kalpasutra from about 1500. Then we have this lovely Uttarajayana Sutra, which friends at SOAS, we spent a lot of time talking about this particular manuscript. But it's the story of 2 herd boys who are born they share multiple births together. So they're born as a pair of deer in the mountains, they're born as a pair of geese by a river, and then they're born as two swapaka, or untouchable boys. Then they undergo great hardships, and they become great Jain saints. But one of them, Chitra, carries on with his saintly, very, very austere way of life. But Sambhuta, as he's sitting here, a queen comes to pay him honor, and as she bows before him, the tips of her hair just touch his feet, and he conceives a wish to be reborn as a great Chakravartin, a great universal ruler, so that he can enjoy great sensual pleasures in his next life. This comes to pass. So the story in the text is, it's probably represented by these two figures here. So here they meet in their next life, and Chitra, because he's done all the right things, he's remained a Jain monk, he meets Sambhuta, who has been born as a great ruler. He's enjoying this sensual life, and he tries to persuade him to give up his sensual life and to become a Jain monk again, but he fails. So Chitra eventually achieves moksha. Sambhuta descends into a great hell for many, many lives. So that's that story. And then, of course, this is the very famous image of the chaste monk, which is in the Peaceful Liberators exhibition. This you can see in the exhibition, the universal man. You can see the shape of the human being, the way that the upper part is the heavens, the middle part is the mortal worlds, and the lower part is the hells. And you can compare that with another image in the V&A showing the 2.5 continents at the center where humans live. This I wanted to show you because this is the Jainpedia manuscript digitization project, which was launched in 2010. Some familiar faces here I think you'll recognize. And here, that's the painting I showed in the last slide. And there's a great effort by volunteers putting in information about it. We'll just finish now. The Shatranjaya, the pilgrimage site, which you think you saw this morning, our new acquisitions. This was actually in 2012, a great pilgrimage map of Shatranjaya, showing the map. It's unusual because it's not only very large, but it's horizontal in format and it's got a blue background. There's a detail of the Adinata temple at the top. And these beautiful paintings, modern paintings by Shanti Panchal. He's a Hindu, but he paints a lot of Jain subjects. And this is a Padabhishek ceremony where a monk is being promoted to Acharya, to the senior grade. So he's painted there, and he draws on traditional Indian painting with the way that the elongated eyes, multiple layers of watercolour to give this incredibly luminous effect. And then he painted another one of the Bahubali of the Mahamastakabhishek in Shamla Belagola in 2018. So here they are. This is my last slide, I promise. Here they are on display in the V&A's Indian Gallery. You can see the Shantinata figure in the background that we talked about, and the Ambikar. And here they are shown next to the Jain manuscript pages from the 15th century. And this is the first time that we've shown modern, contemporary Indian art in our gallery. It always used to stop at about 1900, but we wanted to get outside that box now. And so we chose paintings that related visually to the older paintings, so that's why they're there now. So I will stop talking. Thank you very much. Please come and visit the V&A. Thank you.
Nick Bhai, as we say, Michami Dugdam, apologies for rushing you.
Yeah, no, sorry.
We're going to skip the Q&A in this session, and I think have a quick 5-minute refreshment break before our next session brought to us by two very special sisters. But have your quick refreshment 5-minute break first, okay? Thank you. Sorry to rush you.
No, I thought it would be shorter. I thought it would be. It was much longer than I thought it was going to be. So I'm so sorry about that. Yeah. So I had to gabble a little bit at the end, but I hope it was okay. Thank you so much. Thank you very much indeed.
That was absolutely fantastic.